This episode of the Theology of Business podcast is sponsored by our friends at GWT2 Energy. Do you want to increase the profit margins of your restaurant or retail operation? One way to do that is to lower your energy costs. With over 20 years experience helping restaurants and retailers reduce their energy bills, GWT2 Energy helps owners and operators create a customized energy savings plan that will achieve up to 25% energy savings. To start saving and become more profitable, visit gwt2energy.com. That's the number 2, gwt2energy.com. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Theology of Business podcast. I'm your host, Darren Shearer, and this is the show that helps marketplace Christians to partner with God in business to help you disciple your coworkers, your company, your industry, and your community as followers of Christ. On this show, I typically jump into topics that I'm either researching or just plain curious about, and so I find experts like my guest today, Jeff Haanen, to discuss that topic. And the one that we're going to be diving into today is value making and financial compensation from a biblical perspective. And so we recognize that all work is valuable in the eyes of God. Well, is it? That's the big question. But then if work is a good thing and everybody's work matters, why do we pay people differently? And is that the way that God really intended it? On this episode, we're joined by Jeff Haanen. Jeff is the CEO and founder of the Denver Institute for Faith and Work, an educational nonprofit dedicated to forming men and women to serve God, neighbor, and society through their daily work. And he's the founder of the 5280 Fellowship. Am I saying that right, Jeff?
Yeah, 5280. It's a Denver thing.
5280. That sounds a lot cooler than 5280. A program for emerging leaders in Colorado, and Scattered.org, a free learning platform on faith, work, and culture. So clearly we have an entrepreneur on the show today. He writes for various publications such as Christianity Today on topics ranging from business to retirement to the American working class, and lives in beautiful Denver, Colorado with his wife and 4 daughters. And you can't see his video right now, but I can see it's another beautiful day in Denver. Jeff, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So does all work have equal value in the eyes of God?
Well, that's a good question. Whenever you use terms like all work, you have to be really careful what you say, because work is a human construction. And you have to think about the breadth of what that means. And so is somebody that is providing a service like a mason and building a building, is that work the equal value of, say, an Al-Qaeda warrior? No, I don't think so. So work has moral dimensions, just like people have moral dimensions. And so I think we want to think well about the type of work we're doing, not only who's doing the work and the intentions that we have behind the work, but I actually think that the work itself really matters for building good societies as well as good, strong businesses that are blessing their communities.
Yeah. So what is there a rule of thumb that we could use to make the call when we look at a form of work, and what is the kind of the guiding principle there to determine, is this valuable in the eyes of God?
Well, I think actually what's valuable in the eyes of God is a heart turned to Him in worship and work that is offered to Him as such. And in that respect, I've seen everything from the financial industry to manufacturing to retail to any one of a number of enormous amount of jobs that society may either look highly upon or look really lowly upon, but God would say that was offered to me in worship, and that has value in His eyes. So I actually think God is very concerned with our state of heart and who we're doing it for, as the greatest commandment is about loving God with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength. And if we are doing an activity in which that is offered to Him, I do think that is highly valuable. And the social impact of different types of work is another conversation, though, that I think that we need to think about. What types of things can we do that actually bring about not only value in God's eyes, but real value and benefit to our neighbor. And that's, I think, another conversation we should have.
Yeah. So it's almost as though the extent to which our work is worship determines the value. So there's this correlation between worship and value as it relates to work. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I mean, potentially, the value of our work in God's eyes, the New Testament, especially the words of Jesus, they give us, I think, a vision that there's going to be a great reversal. So this is kind of dangerous, territory. The first will be the last will be first. So the types of work that we actually, I think, find the most valuable, God actually may think that other kinds of work that we don't feel as much as valuable is actually highly valuable, right? So, for instance, I think we care about like what firefighters and teachers do, but do we have the same level of respect for janitors or hedge fund managers? I think you'd get different perspectives of people listening on this too. But I think God actually is concerned first about the heart, but then also about, does that work bring about blessing? Does it bring about human flourishing? Does it bring about the well-being of the customers and the communities and the employees in that context? And that's honestly, there's a lot of shades of gray, of moral gray in a lot of different kinds of work. And we could maybe potentially hop into some of those examples if you'd like. But it's a tricky question. I think what's important is that though there's different types of work and different ranges of value, all people have infinite worth. All workers have infinite worth. And I think that's unchanging.
Yeah. So for those of us who understand that a janitor's work is no less valuable, all things being equal, assuming the janitor is doing his work as worship, just like the hedge fund manager or somebody that probably makes a lot more money than he or she does. We recognize that I mean, God is no respecter of persons in that regard, and yet we are the same people who will pay one person a lot more, in many cases, a whole lot more for one particular job than we will for another particular job. Is there a biblical basis for this, or did we just sort of invent this?
So when it comes to paying people and what the Bible says about that, I think that too is a little tricky. I think it's a little tricky. So let's think about this from actually three angles: an economic angle, a sociological angle, and a theological angle. Okay. So economically, you'd say, well, you pay people based on if there's high demand for those sets of skills, you'd want to pay them a lot, right? Because there's not a lot of people that can do, say, the job of leading a Fortune 500 company. And so they need to make a whole bunch of money. And so to a degree, you see in typical organizations that people that have skills, particularly leadership skills, they tend to make more. People that have kind of a technical skill usually make a little less. And those that have the least skills tend to make the lowest amount, right? So that is, I think, from an economic perspective, what you'd see. Sociologically, though, there's some weird stuff in the world. Like if you think about home healthcare workers, in the last decade, demand for home healthcare workers has risen by over 1 million people. I don't have the specific stat right now, but it was about rising from about 2.5 million home healthcare workers to 3.5 million. So if you think of a rise of demand like that, what would you think that what would happen to the wages of those people? You'd think with the rise of demand, you're like, oh gosh, we need that because our population is aging, that the wages would go up. However, their real wages went down in that same period when demand went up. And you have to ask, why on earth would wages go down, real wages go down for this group of people of which there's more demand for? And the harsh, I think, reality of that is that most home healthcare workers are women of color. They don't sit upon positions of power, which they can determine how much they're going to make and others. And so they're treated more interchangeably. They don't have enough kind of negotiating power to push up some of their wages, right? So especially in the last 50 years, sociologically, unions have gone away in America, not completely, but they've been drastically diminished. And you see the wage disparity between low-income workers and high-income workers really grow, like astronomically. And you can actually see this globally as well as here in the United States. So I think we do need to think about that. biblically speaking, how much should I pay somebody? I actually think that's a real tricky one, because I think God leaves that in many ways up to us. There is some stuff, Paul talks about a worker's worth his wages, right? It actually, in the book of James, it also talks about the wages of poor farmers were withheld from them. And God said, look, I heard their cries. He's actually pulling in Old Testament traditions, and actually from both Exodus as well as Deuteronomy, saying, look, if you're not paying people what they need to be able to survive right now, I'm going to hear their cries, and Yahweh Sabaoth may set his face against you, right? Unless you pay that person well. So that's like the prophetic side. On the just and the good side, you have somebody like Boaz, who allowed a poor immigrant to glean and to be able to work and have a sense of dignity. And it, worked out that, they got married as well. And they created not only a just system and just wages, but a way for them to enter into the community. So in my view on the wage question, am I paying people enough that they can support themselves and their family and engage in the life of their community? I think that is a good question for Christians to ask on the lower end of the pay scale. On the higher end of the pay scale, I think the question to ask is, how much do I really need? Mm-hmm. And how much should I give away? And those are questions of generosity as well as self-limiting. I think there is a guy that we had speak at one of our events called Business for the Common Good. His name is Alan Barnhart. Alan has given away millions and millions of dollars. He gave away his company to his donor advised fund. What was interesting to me when he spoke at Business for the Common Good this last year was not how much money he's given away. It was that he capped his salary at a certain amount, and he refused to take any more than a certain multiple of his lowest wage workers. And I thought the ability to say, no, I'm going to give this away, that even though I run a $500 million company, I don't need that much. There's like the humility of Jesus was dripping on him. So I think there's questions to ask on both end of the pay scale from a biblical perspective on the wage question.
Yeah. And I love that example of Alan Barnhart, and Simon Lee and his company is another one people could dig into, these CEOs capping their salary. So there's this issue of injustice that immediately comes into play when we start to talk about monetary compensation from a biblical perspective. But is there on the other side of the issue, is there a sense of God affirming paying one person more than another? For example, I'm thinking about the issue of timely work versus work that is just not timely. Like if somebody was to just get really bent out of shape right now about, like, I know somebody that's in the event planning business, and her business just got crushed with the coronavirus and the lockdown and social distancing and everything. And so it would be a shame to just sit there and shake your fist at God and shake your fist at everybody else for, like, if you don't pivot and you just assume that, well, this skill set is valuable. Well, in this current market, such as it is, it's not a timely service to try to render. Maybe like virtual events, and that's a shift that she's making. So is there a sense where some people maybe should be paid more than others? And is there a biblical basis for that?
I wouldn't go as far as biblical basis. Maybe you have some illustrations, from the biblical narrative that I don't. But I think we need to think about a handful of things. Hold on real quick. Can we pause the podcast? I'm going to re-answer that question. Can we do that?
Sure.
So to answer the question about the realities of paying people more and less, I think this is obviously true. We're going to want to pay some people more and some people less, right? The founder, Wendy Kopp, the founder of Teach for America, for a long time, she wanted to take the same wage as an entry level teacher in New York, and this was like 20 years ago. And her board eventually said, "Look, you making $25,000 a year is not going to help you or the organization grow and attract the kind of talent we need to build a real movement here, right?" And so they built a pay scale, at one that made sense, right? So absolutely, there are some. I mean, longevity, history of performance, the actual demand for that service that employee is rendering in sort of, and the reality is of the market and the economy. This is all changing right now. There is temporarily less of a demand for hospitality workers. Central Florida is going to have, which is, I was just talking to somebody in Central Florida, major tourist area, and they're going to lose anywhere from 20 to 33% of their hospitality workers. So right now, that has been really depressed. So there's a lot of different factors that go into how much we're paying people. I think still, though, I'll just speak. How about I speak from a very kind of practical side? I lead a small organization. Okay? I have 8 people. How do I pay people, right? People that have more experience and more leadership ability and that have more responsibility to execute on goals, they get paid more. People that have a little less experience, a little less skills, and not quite as much responsibility, they get paid less as well. However, the disparity between how much the lowest paid full-time employee and the highest paid full-time employee, it's not a very big disparity. It's not very big. Now, we're a nonprofit of 8 people, right? But it is something to think about. I still think on a company of 1,000, right? Do you have to pay a CEO, $1 million in salary and 10 million in stock options to be able to attract them, or not? Years ago, I read an interesting story about the Costco CEO. That was compensated something like $500,000 in salary plus stock options, but it was far less than peers. And Costco is one of the most powerful companies in the world as well. So there are still real human questions saying, it's not only about maximal kind of profit gaining, and then even for Christians to give that away. It may be just as Christian to say, we're going to take less of profit this year. I am going to take less of a salary, and I'm going to have an abnormally high entry level wage for my people because I want them all to thrive and to flourish. So I think there's real questions there.
Yeah. And like in the startup world, one of the big question is this business scalable, or is it just sort of what they call a lifestyle business where you're going to maybe see incremental growth, but an investor doesn't typically, like a venture capitalist at that level, isn't going to want to invest in a business that's not scalable. They're going to put their money toward the thing that's scalable. Like, is there a biblical basis for that, or again, are we just sort of, because as you know, this show is about the theology of business. So with something as familiar and we're so we're so dependent on our livelihood, and how we compensate people is such a part of our way of life. It just seems like something we need to, if we're going to be paying more for this type of product and less for this other one, when they're basically the same, like, or paying this person more, this person less, when they're basically when they're doing a similar type of a job. Like, what are the go-to biblical passages to help to shape that framework for how we approach that?
What are the of how much we should pay people in different industries? Do you mean, Darren?
Well, basically, the extent to which it's biblically, there's a biblical basis for paying some people more and some people less. Like, thinking about the parable of talents, and so they were each entrusted with different amounts, each according to his own ability. So, and then we got the example of the workers that were all basically paid the same, even though they didn't work the same amount. And so there's like a lot of very interesting and even potentially confusing passages that as we think about this in the Bible.
Yeah, we're in weird territory if we try to do too much direct Bible verse application to modern wage conversations.
Mm-hmm.
So, like the parable of the talents, like I've heard this quoted ad nauseum about stewardship, meaning God entrusted this much money to me. This I have to, have a kingdom return of this much amount as well. But did that mean that God was deciding that all the rich people that have the wealth right now, that God would give those money to them, whereas people that don't have the wealth right now, he wouldn't entrust as much to them? Maybe. I've heard that in Protestant circles, but Catholics wouldn't think about it that way at all, actually. Because wages don't necessarily come to people because of only like God said you should have this much money, right? That's not the only way people make money. So I think that's real tricky. If you want to do another weird wage Bible story, it's when Jesus, has the parable of the farm owner that pays all the dudes the same amount. The one that worked at the beginning of the day worked, one that started at the middle of the day, and one that started at the end of the day. He paid all the same amount because the point of that parable wasn't necessarily about wages. The point was about grace, right? It was a context of like, hey, I know the Gentiles are later to the game, but my grace is going to be poured out on them as well as to the Jewish people. And I know that makes you frustrated right there. So again, we go too much in our biblical kind of application if we try to say this is the Bible verse that we then apply to this conversation about wages today. However, the Bible doesn't leave us, empty-handed here. Again, Ruth, Deuteronomy, the book of James, the prophetic witness of people having enough to provide for themselves, right? Even the prophetic imagination in Isaiah, it talks about people building their houses and having enough to sit under their own trees, right? This real connection between my work and having enough to live a good life. Like there are things like that when systems get distorted and people don't have that, and they can find themselves working one or two jobs, but never own a house and get further in debt. Like here's a questions of systemic issues that I think believers need to be thinking about, right? So love God, love your neighbor, and your employee is your neighbor. It's not to say that everybody should make the same. I don't necessarily agree with that, but your employer is your neighbor, and God is present in the needs of your neighbor. So yeah. I think we should think about it in terms of, what is it? How much do I need? How much does the company need to be able to attract talent, to be able to lead? And then what does it mean to be not only a generous person, but a generous business, right? That I may pay people even more than market says on the front line because I want to retain good people. And I want to bless them.
Yeah. So are we saying that the biblical framework for thinking about a monetary compensation is pay everybody a fair wage, or some might say pay them a livable wage? So maybe there's difference between fair wage and livable wage, but this is there's a lot of gray area, as you were saying, like the passage about Jesus and the workers out in the vineyard that were all paid the same, even though one of them just came at the very end of the day, and people were like, what in the world? Like, why is he getting paid the same as us? And as you said, it's a message about grace. You could also think about maybe it's like if you ever try to buy, of course it's different right now in this economic environment, but try to buy a plane ticket at the last second, you're probably going to pay a lot more for that. Maybe there was some of that that dynamic going where the manager just needed extra work at the very end of the day, and it was hard to come by potentially. I don't know, but I totally agree with what you're saying about you can't just take a proof text and say, hey, there's our theology of monetary compensation. But I'm trying to understand, and I'm hoping our listeners are curious about this too, is what is our theological framework, our biblical framework for thinking not just about work being valuable in the eyes of God, which we agree that if it's morally good work, then yeah, whether you're a janitor or whether you're a hedge fund manager or school teacher, all work is valuable in the eyes of God, assuming it's being done as an act of worship. But then when we turn around and take our wages and then go pay somebody, we're paying people differently for different things. And what is the biblical framework for thinking about how to do that properly?
Yeah. 1 Timothy 5:18, scripture says, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain, and the laborer deserves his wages. Of course, Paul here is pulling on these Old Testament verses like Leviticus 19:13. You shall not oppress your neighbor or rob him. The wages of a hired servant shall not remain with you all night until morning. That's because people that were living day to day, they needed the wages right there. So you could think about paying fairly, paying promptly, right? And being aware that if you are a dad of 3 kids, a fair or even a livable wage looks very different than if you're a single guy. Mm-hmm. I think those are human conversations that, without setting sort of a floor or a ceiling, the biblical paradigm is love your neighbor as yourself. So I'll go back into early part of my career. I worked for a small Christian school, and the wages were oppressive. Like if we had an unexpected $20 expense that month, stress, anxiety, my wife would get in like arguments and fights about how could you have done this. We couldn't really participate in the social life of our community. We didn't have much. And that was really early in my career. And that was a reality. Now, there are millions of people that live in that right there. And I'm not saying everybody should make the same. However, if there are people that you can pay and you can build business models that benefit employees just as much as investors and customers, I think this is pleasing in God's sight.
Yeah. And the passage you mentioned coming from Leviticus about, don't muzzle an ox while he's threshing. It says a laborer is worthy of his hire. So it's whatever you were hired to do. And I think what was happening there is people had actually agreed that, okay, this is what the arrangement is. This is what I'm going to get paid. And they weren't paying what they said they were going to pay, which is a totally next level of injustice, where you said you were going to, but as far as these are the established wages and we're just going to pay what the market will bear. I like what Jeff Van Duzer says, and it comes up again and again, that especially around the issue of wages and compensation, is that the invisible hand of, from Adam Smith's work is not necessarily the almighty hand of God. And so we can't just rely on what the market will bear to tell us, are we obeying God in the way that we approach financial compensation?
Yeah. And the question is, okay, love your neighbor as yourself. What do I need to feel like I can live a good life? What kind of a house, or what kind of a car or food? Like, what do I need? That is how you are to love your neighbor as yourself, because you're thinking about your own needs, right? Does other person have kind of less important needs than you do? Well, that is actually the question. And that is, I think, an intercultural question that we can have as well. Like, what are those? And I think those are real questions that we need to grapple with. That no, people aren't just making a certain amount because that's what their labor deserves. A lot of people are making a certain amount because that's how the markets have been designed, or that's kind of the going rate right now, or they didn't have the same amount of opportunities, that we have, right? So there's a real opportunity for love, for human flourishing in our businesses as we think about wages, and using wages also as a tool to attract really talented people that can help drive change. Like you need that as well. So I think it goes both ways.
Yeah. And this issue, this really a theological issue as I see it, is at the heart of why people gravitate toward one economic system or another one, right? And I know you're an economist. You say that The Economist is the best magazine in the world, hands down. So I know you're well versed in this, but wouldn't you agree that this trying to understand and take a stand on this issue is what kind of makes a socialist out of somebody or makes a capitalist out of the next person?
I guess I would disagree with that. I know people of various different political persuasions, and I don't think that we have to go to thinking about like the government controlling the means of production to actually think about good wages for your employees. I actually think you can live in a free market system, but not obey the free market system. You can obey God and say, what does it mean to do well, to provide goods and services to our community that brings real value, as well as real value to our employees. So I don't think that this issue makes you a capitalist or a socialist. I think thoughtful engagement of this issue, and actually a lot of issues around money, means you're trying to apply ethics. You're trying to apply a broader cultural framework, a countercultural framework to how you're making business decisions. I think that's an important thing.
Yeah, because if it's just raw unbridled socialism or raw unbridled capitalism, I mean, both of those are going to be just extremely destructive. So it's not as a Christian, and that's why we go to the Bible instead of going to what Adam Smith wrote or what Karl Marx wrote, or I mean, like, yeah, understand what the different perspectives are, but have a good, solid theology of business for how you're thinking about this.
Absolutely. Yeah. To the point of the importance of your podcast, we need to think about our business in terms of the broader story of God's activity in the world, rather than sort of take the assumptions from our culture. And if you're listening in China, you're probably thinking about it more in terms of a communist perspective. If you're in America, of course, it would be more of a capitalist perspective. Read widely, read broadly, understand the best economic thinkers, right? From Keynes to Schumpeter, but we really need to reevaluate, especially in a very painful economic time right now. Lord, what are you calling me to? How can I bless others as you've blessed me, especially for most business owners? This is a really important time for us to think about generosity, not only in terms of what we give away, but also in terms of what we keep in the company to bless our employees and help them live good, God-honoring lives as well.
Yeah, excellent. Well, Jeff, as we wrap it up, tell us about what you're working on and how people can get involved.
Yeah, sure. So I lead an organization called Denver Institute for Faith and Work. We do a handful of things. We provide people content, everything from free short courses to a podcast, to articles, all on how faith shapes work in different kinds of industries. We have a young leaders program that's principally for those in the Denver metro area called the 5280 Fellowship. 5280 is from the Mile High City, because Denver is a Mile High City, and 5,280 feet are in a mile. So that's where that came from. And then we do public events as well. And some of them are more local, and some of them we have a national or international draw. Our event Business for the Common Good draws people from all over the place. And we do that late January, early February every year. So the best way to get in touch with what we're doing, go to denverinstitute.org and sign up for our newsletter. And you can start learning about what it means to follow Jesus as a carpenter, craftsman, woman caring for kids and doing a part-time job, as somebody in finance or a business owner. So we got a lot of stuff out there.
Beautiful. Well, Jeff, thanks for what you're doing. Thank you for sharing your time and your wisdom perspective with us. I know we're all better for it.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode. You can share your feedback and get more information to help you partner with God in business and disciple your company, your industry, and your community at theologyofbusiness.com. The Theology of Business podcast is sponsored by Highbridge Books and Media, a media agency specializing in publishing and promoting the world-changing ideas of inspiring thought leaders through book publishing, website development, publicity, email marketing, social media management, podcast management, and video-based course publishing. Take the next step to share your message with the world by contacting us at highbridgemedia.com. Thanks for listening, and keep partnering with God in your business.